Hello, I'm Jim Garrison, President of the Chester County Historic Preservation Network, and it is my distinct pleasure this morning to be starting off this great workshop program consisting of 4 sessions. Our opening speaker is a special guest, Tom Mays from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, but our 4 speakers this morning all have topics that revolve around special places, what they mean, how to protect them, and how important they have become in this time of great stress. I think you'll see how all these topics relate to each other and how they are now more important than ever. This place matters, this old place matters, the National Register of Historic Places. Many of us have seen these taglines attached to magazine articles, plaques, or online posts. But what do they really mean? What is a place? Architects and planners talk about placemaking, but what about places that already exist? Landscapes 3 from the Chester County Planning Commission talks about the special sense of place that is Chester County. Is it one place or many, or maybe a collection of memories and experiences? Discussions about old or historic places have traditionally revolved around specific artifacts or tangible assets, yet the things that make a place special or memorable are much deeper. Tom Mays from the National Trust for Historic Preservation has written and spoken on the topic of places and the importance of recognizing the qualities that make them matter. There are a number of qualities related to place, but one is especially important now. Places can foster a sense of community, and old places can make that sense something which can be shared on many levels. The layered quality of these old places promotes a richer dialogue than might occur in a new urbanist mixed-use development or curated historical setting. Too often, discussions about historic preservation reference a particular resource and not the sense of place that that resource contributes to. Tom Mays writes that organic interaction between people and places is one of the main things that fosters a sense of community. Without the physical artifacts as authentic reminders of the past, part of that interaction is lost. The stories attached to the artifacts are what complete the dialogue. The beauty of the story is that as it evolves, it is a dialogue between the storyteller and the listener. In the case of recent history, it can involve firsthand witnesses. For things more distant, it is about interpretation. The common thread here is a conversation between the past, present, and future. Old places bear witness to different periods and will always have a story to tell, especially to those who are willing to listen. Our sense of community is being tested by the current events, yet our environment suggests a resiliency developed over time and nurtured by our history. The places associated with the events of the past are diverse. From the early settlement through the American Revolution, there are places that inform these stories. More recent history is also rooted in places where the story is still developing. Coming back to the word place, it is a combination of things. There is something about a place that is memorable, an event or a natural or man-made feature. Just as important is the evolving narrative that contributes to the experience of place. Communities have physical and virtual presences. Physical communities can be rural townships, a borough with a vibrant downtown, or even a location largely shaped by development in the recent past. Virtual communities thrive on connections to shared experiences. Places and communities, linked by stories that enlighten and inspire, are the cornerstones of historic preservation. And now for a quick reminder that this program is actually 4 separate invitations, one for each session, and that will help us stay on schedule. So I'm going to end very quickly. That the chat rooms will remain open for a short time after the presentation if you haven't had a chance to finish with your questions. But now it is my privilege to turn things over to Mary Donati to introduce Tom Mays. Mary has been a leader in local and national preservation matters through her leadership positions at the National Trust and partnership with John Milner in one of the most distinguished architectural firms in the country. And now to Mary.
Thank you so much, Jim. I'm sorry I don't have my face on the screen, but I'm having internet connection problems here. But I am here. Thank you. Now I have the honor of introducing my longtime dear friend and preservation colleague, Tom Mays, who's the Chief Legal Officer and General Counsel for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He has written and spoken widely on preservation law, the underlying purposes of historic preservation, and the future of historic preservation. For many years, he taught historic preservation law at the University of Maryland. A recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts Rome Prize in Historic Preservation in 2013, Mr. Mays is the author of Why Old Places Matter. Mr. Mays received his bachelor's degree with honors in history in 1981 and his Juris Doctor in 1985 from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and a Master of Arts in Writing from Johns Hopkins University. Tom, take it away.
Thank you, Mary. I hope everyone can now see my screen. I hope you're seeing my presentation, Why Old Places Matter. Well, first, let me thank Mary Donati for that kind introduction, but also for all of her work in preservation as an architect, as an advisor and trustee to the National Trust, as a director at Cliveden, a National Trust historic site in Germantown, and as a good friend who I and the National Trust have always relied on for her good counsel and for her friendship. Thank you very much, Mary. And thanks to Jim Garrison for that kind introduction to the workshop and for his work writing a column in anticipation of this workshop for the Ledger. And also, as some of you may not know, for his very early work on another National Trust historic site, Decatur House. I also want to thank Kathleen Hood for helping set up my presentation and for our shared regard for birds as well as for buildings. And finally, to Suzanne Emrich, who's going to help me with questions at the end of the presentation. As you know from the introduction, the work I'm going to talk about today is the product of my fellowship at the American Academy in Rome, and with thanks to the National Trust, which permitted me to do that, and which resulted in the book, Why Old Places Matter. This first image is the main building at the American Academy in Rome, designed by McKim, Mead, and White. It's on the Janiculum Hill on the west side of Rome and overlooks the city. And it was a wonderful place to try to do this work. There we are. I mentioned the book, Why Old Places Matter, and it was the result of my time at the Academy. And it was originally published as a series of essays by the Preservation Forum of the National Trust, and then published as a collection by Roman and Littlefield. I hope you'll give it a try. It's available from the publisher and also from Amazon. But let me turn to the main topic. Why do old places matter to people? I set out to explore this topic because of my experience teaching and writing about historic preservation law. I would begin each course with a discussion about why we have historic preservation law And a little bit to my surprise, the conversation would immediately turn to the broader question of why we have historic preservation at all. I discovered that these students who were graduate students in historic preservation and that people more broadly really didn't have the words and phrases to describe why these old places in our communities and in our lives seem to matter so much to them. People would talk about preserving our heritage and property values and tourism, but these phrases didn't seem to capture the deeply held passion about these places. So I began to gather these reasons together and to think about them. My idea was to give people the words and phrases to express why old places mattered to them and to hopefully build a stronger ethic of historic preservation in their communities and in the countries and in the country. I wanted people to think about it for themselves and then express what they thought mattered. And let me say at the outset that I don't think there's a set number of reasons. I think there are as many reasons and as many combinations of reasons at any one place and for any one person. But what I really hope for is that people think about why old places matter to them for themselves. So as I go through this PowerPoint, please be thinking about why old places matter to you, why they may matter to other people, and how you would express why old places matter to you as you explain it to others. I hope that you will raise questions and that we will have a conversation at the end of the presentation. So let me begin with one of the words I heard most often as I interviewed people, continuity. Old places give people a sense of continuity in a world that is constantly changing, as we have seen over the past year in particular. Old places provide people with a sense of being part of a continuum that is necessary for them to be psychologically and emotionally healthy. Maria Lewicka, an environmental psychologist, says that the majority of authors agree that the development of emotional bonds with places is a prerequisite of psychological balance and good adjustment, and that it helps to overcome identity crises and gives people the sense of stability they need in the ever-changing world. We often see this in the schools and churches in our communities. In the upper right is Caldwell Station School in Huntersville, North Carolina, where my father went to school and which remains a community preschool today, giving people that sense of continuity. But perhaps we see this most forcefully when the continuity between people and place is broken, such as the place on the left, Palmer Chapel, in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, where people who were forcibly removed from their homes to turn this into a national park continue to return for reunions and gatherings, even 3 and 4 generations later. This happens all over the world. In the lower right is Matera, Italy, where people were forcibly removed from these half-cave dwellings for supposedly better housing. And yet a guide told us that her grandmother always said that the community was never the same after they were removed. Old places matter because they give people a sense of continuity. Memory. Old places help us remember. And I'm going to say, I say this in every presentation, but here it is, the quote from Mary Donati. The architect Mary Donati tells her granddaughter, old buildings are like memories you can touch. Memory is an essential part of consciousness. Without memory, we are hardly ourselves. We've seen this in how we react to people who have Alzheimer's or other conditions where they lose their memory. Their identity is partially erased. And there is, as the geographers Stephen Holscher and Derek Alderman say, an inextricable link between memory and place. People anchor their divergent memories in place. There are two aspects of memory and place, individual memory, and here I use as an example the Cafe Reggio shown in the upper left, which I frequented when I was in my 20s, and which I continue to return to today, both to see that the place is the same and to refresh my memories, but also to see how I may have changed in the many years since I frequented that place. And then there is collective memory, which is a collective societal sense of memory. When we see this image of the reflecting pool, we remember the idea of the March on Washington, even though many of us may not have even been alive when it occurred. That place conjures that memory. People may also, places may also themselves embed memories that people may not know. In the lower left is an old cemetery gate at the cemetery where I will eventually be buried, which, as you can see, does not have a stone wall that goes with it. That gate retains the memory of the stone wall that once surrounded it. And there are examples of this type of place memory throughout the world. Old places serve as mnemonic aids that anchor our memory. Individual identity. Old places embody our identity. People have long recognized this link between place and identity, from Cicero, who wrote of returning to his grandfather's house, to James Marston Fitch, who wrote that preservation affords the opportunity for the citizens to regain a sense of identity with their own origins, of which they have often been robbed by the sheer process of urbanization. Psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, and architectural theorists all study the relationship between place and identity, and most would agree that place is inextricably linked with the development and maintenance of continuity of self. There are those who even theorize that identity and place are inseparable, that people are always in and of place, that life itself begins and ends with place. Our sense of identity with place is not static, however, it changes over time. We may form identities with different places. Here in the upper left, I show the church I was raised in, to which my family has long ties. And in the lower left, my great-grandfather's simple white North Carolina farmhouse. But I've also formed attachments with other places. In the upper right, DuPont Circle, where I've lived for 30 years. And in the lower right, with the American Academy in Rome. And to my surprise, I found that these places did not even have to be particularly old, only old enough for people to form identities around. In the center is the Eastland Mall in Charlotte, North Carolina, the mall of my teen years. Much to my surprise, while I was writing this essay, and Eastland Mall was proposed to be demolished, a local preservation group sprang up to try to save it, saying that it embodied the identity of that part of Charlotte. In fact, even the demolition contractor hired to tear down the mall set up a memory site for people to share their memories. It turned out he'd met his future wife ice skating at Eastland Mall. Old places embody our individual identity. Civic identity. Old places embody our civic, state, national, and universal identity. Independence Hall, shown here, and countless other places embody the history and principles of the United States. And the preservation movement has long championed these places. Patriotism and national identity have been key drivers of the preservation movement, particularly under the Historic Sites Act of 1935. But I noted as I talked to people that we no longer feel very comfortable talking about patriotism as a reason to save old places, a reticence that reflects what Edward Said described as the vexed issue of nationalism and national identity, of how memories of the past are shaped in accordance with a certain notion of what we, or for that matter, they really are. The truth of the matter is that we have left people out. Enslaved people were not mentioned at plantation houses. Native Americans were treated as the enemy, and countless workers and everyday people were simply not acknowledged. And national identity can be manipulated. In the upper center is a building in Rome called the Square Colosseum that Mussolini had built specifically to try to tie his regime to the idea of the original Colosseum and to imperial Rome. But the thing about old places that's fascinating to me is that the continued presence of old places permits and may even foster the acknowledgement of changed identities and the transformation of identity over time. The way slavery is not only now acknowledged at Monticello and Mount Vernon, but becomes a central part of the story. Old places also often become the vortex for these discussions, however comfortable they may be. And here I use as the illustration the Confederate Memorial in my hometown of Cornelius, North Carolina, which has become the center for discussions about our changed identities. There are also places that form a part of our universal identity, our identity as humans. We felt that universal sense of our shared identity when the giant Buddhas at Bamiyan were destroyed, or even when flames burned Notre Dame in Paris. We feel it when we see the pyramids. These are parts of our world that belong to all of us. Old places are part of our ever-evolving collective identity. Old places are beautiful. If you Google beautiful places, you'll come up with lists of natural places and old places with only a smattering of new buildings. Beauty and the threat to beautiful places was the driving force for many early preservation efforts, and beauty remains at the heart of why people care about old places. We all know how much harder it is to save an ugly building than it is to save a beautiful building. Yet, as I talk to people about beauty as a reason, just like with national identity, I found that people were reticent to talk about it. And I think that people on preservation commissions and in other public fora are also hesitant to make decisions based on beauty. Despite the fact that preservation is sometimes called aesthetic regulation, we don't often expressly ground our decisions in the idea of beauty. This is for many reasons: the subjective nature of beauty, the difficulty of defining it, the loaded cultural aspects of beauty, or the fact that it may simply be considered frivolous or expendable. Yet beauty is still something that delights, moves, and satisfies people. A study by the British Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment found that beauty is a deeply positive experience, contributing to happiness and well-being. Yet again, here's the really interesting thing. Preservation is the public forum where concepts of beauty change. Preservation has been a march of the ugly transforming into the beautiful. Victorian houses were once considered ugly, even in my lifetime. Art Deco and Moderne were considered hopelessly commercial. Mid-century modern, even brutalism, is just now being appreciated. Even I found beauty in the heavily graffitied concrete of Miami Marine Stadium, shown in the center bottom here. Preservation is the public forum where through our work, these notions of beauty in society change. I think we should learn to talk about the beauty of old places, the psychological and sociological benefits of beauty, and to demand beauty in our cities, towns, and communities. Old places matter because they are, or because they may become, beautiful. History and learning. Old places give us an understanding of history that no other documents or evidence possibly can. How? Old places have the unique ability to have people experience history with all of their senses. It tells us different information. It allows us to experience history with full body immersion. I show in the lower left President Lincoln's cottage, where people can walk in Lincoln's footsteps and inhabit the spaces he inhabited. People want to be able to touch the handrail Lincoln touched. It connects them to him directly. And in the upper left is Emily Dickinson's house in Amherst, Massachusetts, where people can understand something about her poetry and her life that they cannot understand from simply reading about it. And there are battlefields where people have told me that they couldn't understand the battle until they saw the battlefield, why some soldiers coming over a rise survived and others did not. In the lower center is Old Salem, North Carolina, where I vividly remember being at a Moravian love feast as a child and hearing our guide sing a Moravian song a cappella in a low vaulted stone room. I'll note that the field trips are often the only part of a history class that people remember later in life. But there are also broader things that we learn simply because of the survival of a place. In the upper right are two images of one of my favorite historic sites in the country, the Quan Tai Temple in Mendocino, California, built in 1854 by Chinese immigrants. As one of the descendants of the Chinese immigrants put it to me on a visit, and she's shown in the center, what we learn here is that we were here. Old places matter because they are the most vivid places to learn about history and about ourselves. Architecture. Old places as architecture are part of our cultural inheritance. We love old buildings that are architecturally significant because they are part of the cultural heritage of all humankind, but also because of how they make us feel. I remember the feeling I had as a child in an old house that one of my father's friends used as a barn. It had been built by a master builder, and it felt all of a whole. I didn't know then that probably what I was experiencing in those tall old rooms was probably proportion, balance, and harmony. It was architecture with a capital A. In many classical and neoclassical buildings, like the Pantheon shown here, we feel the emotional impact of proportion, balance, and harmony. At Farnsworth House, the upper left, we feel Mies van der Rohe's attempt to embed a house as much as possible in nature and as form following function. As the National Trust architect Ashley Wilson pointed out recently, this is one of the most significant buildings in the history of architecture. After Farnsworth House, nothing was ever the same. Architects and designers looked to old architecture, whether the Pantheon or the Farnsworth House, as models and inspiration. And that's important enough because they designed the places where we live, work, and play every day. Significant architecture is part of our cultural heritage and is no different from any other great art. But there's something more. As the Finnish architect Juhani Palasma points out, architecture is also important because it places us on the continuum of time and offers us reliable messages of continuity. And this is true for the many old places in our communities. From the town hall to the courthouse, they immediately place people on the continuum of time. Sacredness. Some old places matter because they're sacred or because they're considered sacred. People all over the world find old places like the Sanctuario de Chimayo in New Mexico, shown here, to be places that move them. They actively seek to experience the feelings like the ones I had at that remarkable place. From the Wailing Wall of Jerusalem, the Kaaba at Mecca, St. Peter's Basilica, Santiago de Compostela, to the Shrine of Ise in Japan and Varanasi in India, sacred places have been revered for thousands of years by many different cultures. As Bob Yeager from Partners for Sacred Places says, these are places that are viewed as different, as set apart by the community. And there's something awesome in these places, something that lifts you up and takes you out of your normal life. There are ways, in addition to the religious, that places are considered sacred. Sites of conscience are often considered sacred. They have been sanctified by the things that happen there. Places such as battlefields, cemeteries, or a place the National Trust has been working to save in Richmond, Virginia, shown in the upper right as an archaeological site, Shockoe Bottom, one of the largest slave trading centers of the South, a place of conscience. Old places matter because they are revered as being sacred. Creativity. Old places spur creativity. People are inspired by old places to compose, write, and do other creative work. In the lower photo is RCA Studio A in Nashville, Tennessee, where Elvis recorded, where Dolly Parton recorded Jolene, and which was saved through the efforts of the musician Ben Folds so that it can continue as a place of creativity with its distinctive acoustics. Old places like this seem to transmit artistic legacies. In the image on the upper left and on the right, we see the studio of Daniel Chester French, a National Trust historic site in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where I chaired a panel on creativity in old places with a contemporary sculptor, Judith Shea, and a contemporary composer, Eric Nathan. French was the sculptor of the seated Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial, and the studio and grounds continue to inspire artists today through sculpture shows and residencies. In the lower center is Santa Sabina, a 4th century church in Rome, which inspired Eric to write a work commissioned by the Boston Symphony that he, with my delighted permission, titled Why Old Places Matter, and that seeks to capture in music the feelings that people have in old places. Why is it the case that old places spur creativity? I'm not entirely sure, but the one study I know of that tries to isolate the impact of age of a building on people found that people's imaginations are spurred more by old places. And the urbanist Richard Florida doesn't say why, but he observed the reality that the creative class is drawn to old places. One of the key ingredients of creative places, according to Florida, is authenticity, as in real buildings, real people, and real history is key. The National Trust Preservation Green Lab has also demonstrated the power of older, smaller buildings in spurring startups and other economic and social activity. As the American economy increasingly turns to creative work, this may be an increasingly important reason to keep and reuse old places. Old places spur creativity. Ancestry. Old places connect us to our ancestors. Making a connection to our ancestors was once an explicit reason that we sought to save old places. But over the decades, preservationists have shied away from talking about this connection. Why? Probably because it was perceived of as being elitist and exclusionary. Yet in recent years, the field of genealogical research has exploded in scale, as witnessed by Ancestry.com and TV programs like Skip Gates' Finding Your Roots. The upper left is Somerset Plantation in North Carolina, a state historic site that became one of the first Southern plantation sites to intentionally foster a connection between the site and the descendants of the enslaved people who once lived and worked at the site. And in the upper right is Chet Atkins, who wrote of the deep sense of satisfaction he felt being able to visit Civil War battlefields where his ancestors fought. Being able to connect with the places where people's ancestors lived and worked, whether Ellis Island, shown here in the center, or the simple white farmhouse in North Carolina, where my great-grandfather lived, shown in the left, gives people a deep sense of satisfaction, a sense of identity and belonging. As Dorothy Sproul Redford said about Somerset Place, people need that. They need tangibility. They need something they can touch, that they can hold, look at, point to. The day I first stepped onto the ground of Somerset, I felt a tangibility more intense than all the documents and records I'd collected. Old places matter because they connect us to our ancestors. Community, which Jim referred to earlier. Old places foster community. But how do old places, old buildings, old cities and towns foster community? What particular role do old places play? The writer Wendell Berry says that a community is the mental and spiritual condition of knowing that the place is shared. Old places foster community by giving people a sense of shared identity through landmarks, history, memory, and stories, by having the attributes that foster community, such as distinctive character and walkability, and by serving as shared places where people meet and gather. A great example of the way old places foster community is how we experience post offices. Local post offices, often architecturally distinctive and in the center of town, serve as both meeting places and community landmarks of identity, like the one shown in the lower center in La Jolla, California. For decades, planners, academics, preservationists, and everyday people have lamented the way sprawl has destroyed the American landscape, diminished the distinctiveness of places, and eviscerated the vitality of older towns and cities. Essentially, how it has destroyed community. As Jim said, new urbanists promote placemaking, the design of new places to foster a distinctiveness of place and a sense of community. Developers of new places advertise walkability and design with front porches, alleys, and garages behind the houses, and open spaces and squares, and a mix of retail, residential, and workplaces, the very things that many old places already have, that are intended to allow people to interact with each other, to avoid getting in their car, and therefore create the conditions that foster community. I applaud these efforts, yet something critically important is often overlooked, and that is the idea that the development of a real community takes time. Community develops through the interaction between people and place over time. We cannot build a community. We can only foster the conditions in which communities can grow and thrive. If community is shared experience expressed in a common physical place, old places are crucial. Old places are where people, time, and place have intertwined to form community. Sustainability. The architect Carl Elefante said that the greenest building is the building that is already built. The reuse of existing buildings results in a large number of sustainability benefits. I'm going to tick through a few. Land conservation, because the reuse of the building doesn't require the use of new land. Habitat conservation, because the reuse of the building doesn't take away natural habitat. Reduced fuel consumption, because existing buildings are usually walkable and dense. The avoidance of adverse impacts from the extraction and transportation of new materials, because new materials do not have to be taken from mines, forests, quarries, or other places, and then shipped across the country or the world and used in the new building. And the avoidance of new landfill material, because the building isn't ending up in a landfill and the existing materials are reused. The Research and Policy Lab at the National Trust found that it takes 10 to 80 years for a new building that is 30% more efficient than an existing building to overcome the negative climate change impacts related to new construction. Think about this tile floor from my apartment building in Washington, D.C., which is 100 years old and which has been used continuously for 100 years. How much more sustainable can you get than that? With maintenance, it will continue for hundreds of years more. In addition, the reuse of historic buildings takes advantage of the existing positive environmental passive design of many old buildings, like the light wells and clear story windows shown here with this store in Washington, D.C. In addition, there are those who say that a building or community that has itself grown organically as part of the environment may itself be considered part of the ecology of a place, that older places are themselves ecologies that should be recognized and nurtured. I don't think the green values of old buildings have been fully recognized, but I do think that the issue of sustainability, avoided impact, embodied energy, and carbon footprint have the greatest capacity right now to fundamentally shift the paradigm about how society views old buildings. Old places matter because using and reusing them is environmentally sustainable. Economics. I saved economics for last intentionally, not because it's not important, because it's been the one area that preservationists have emphasized the most in order to convince town councils and others to save old places. While old places matter because they support a sound, sustainable, and vibrant economy. And while I don't think we should reduce the many powerful qualities of old places to simply an economic calculation, the good news is that dozens of studies have proven that historic preservation, that saving and reusing old places is good for the economy. And the economic reasons are closely related to many of the other reasons that I've just described. Here I show the Uline Arena in Washington, D.C., the American Brewery Building in the Upper Center in Baltimore, Maryland, and Grandview House in Virginia, as well as the city of Savannah, which has a booming tourist economy. Old places, again, I'm going to tick through a few things, attract tourists, as we saw from all those people traveling to experience history, learning, beauty, or to take pilgrimages to sacred sites. Old places attract talent and investment, as Richard Florida observed in his work on the creative class. Old places serve as incubators for small businesses, as documented by the Preservation Green Lab reports on the reuse of older buildings. Old places create jobs and good wages, because rehabilitation tends to be more labor intensive than new construction, and because it requires higher skill sets, it tends to pay higher wages, and the money from rehabilitation tends to stay in the community more than new construction. Old places revitalize neighborhoods and communities. In fact, it's often the primary asset that communities have, and if they capitalize on it, as our National Main Street program has done, it can be a key revitalization strategy. Some economists are beginning to try to capture more values in their work, particularly health factors such as walkability or even happiness. Just imagine if these economic studies could capture the full value old places give people, the sense of identity and belonging, the awe of beauty, the creativity and imagination. Their value would be incalculable. Old places matter because they foster a strong and sustainable economy. Through this exploration into why old places matter, I've become even more convinced that old places matter deeply to people and to society, and for more reasons than I thought. Old places are necessary for our psychological and emotional health. They ground us with a sense of belonging. They inspire us in creativity. They soothe us with beauty and sacredness. They help us know who we are. And Chester County is just such an old place. It is rich in old places, from stone bridges uh, to covered bridges, from iron furnaces to historic canals, from farmhouses to stone mills and historic districts, to battlefields, to, to also the places the National Trust protects through easements, and Selma Mill, the Townsend Lundale Farm, and Waynesboro. As I think about Chester County and why the old places of Chester County matter, I believe they matter for many of the reasons that old places matter everywhere. There's history, of course. This is where Valley Forge is located, a key story in our national identity. There are other reasons. There are the economic benefits spurred by the tourism fostered by this place. There's continuity with the past and the future. And there is community, as Jim said, the way this place and its people have intertwined with time. I put this image of the American Brewery building back up because I used it in a presentation at the American Academy. It's a tax credit project in Baltimore that was structured by the National Trust subsidiary, the National Trust Community Investment Corporation. I was astonished after my presentation when one of the other fellows at the Academy, who suffers from a debilitating disease, told me how, as a graduate student at Johns Hopkins, the rehabilitation of this building seemed emotionally important to her as she was first grappling with the disease, and that she would intentionally walk by it on her way to Hopkins as it was being rehabbed, that the rehab of this building gave her a sense of hope. When riots erupted in Baltimore after I returned home from Rome, I was stunned to see this image show up in the news. The American Brewery building survived a fire at a building being built nearby. And the Reverend Dante L. Hickman Sr. from New Shiloh Baptist Church was interviewed in the New York Times talking about plans to rebuild. He spoke about creating a workforce development program, health services, life coaching, and mortgage lending. He pointed to a broad field across the street that the church has acquired to build a youth center and an abandoned laundry that he hopes to convert to more housing. We have a mantra, he said. We restore people as we restore buildings. I think this is why old places, old buildings matter, because they have the power to fulfill deep and fundamental human needs. Thank you. And now I hope we have time for some questions and interactions with you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. We'll take some questions. Looks like we've got about 15 minutes. There's been a couple questions posted. I guess someone was asking about your page 6 quote.
I'm sorry, could you say that again, Suzanne?
Heidi asks about your quote on page 6. The attribution, please.
Okay. Let's just see what that is. Have to see which quote it was. Fortunately, I have it here somewhere. Let's see. Ah, that is James Marston Fitch.
Great. So David Blackburn writes, he thanks you for your thoughts. In places like Philadelphia, the largest poor city in the United States, where there are significant social issues of food insecurity, housing insecurity, endemic racism, etc. In your opinion, how does an institution or a government use the concept of old places matter when a family is impacted by gun violence, homelessness, etc.? This may be addressed by the next presentation, but I'm curious as to your thoughts on the subject. And again, he thanks you for your time, thoughts, and passion.
Great, thank you. That's a wonderful question, and there are a variety of answers to it. In a different presentation that I do, I talk about the essay I wrote about Notre Dame, and it raises some of the same questions. When Notre Dame burned, I did an essay for the National Trust, and one of the very thoughtful comments that was posted on Facebook in response to the essay was raising these questions, particularly because so much money was raised so quickly for Notre Dame. And at a time when people have homelessness and a lack of health care and a host of other things, including a lack of safety. And I responded that then that I also believe that those things were essential. And I do firmly believe that it is essential for people to have a sense of safety and security. In Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the sense of belongingness comes immediately after some of the needs that that the gentleman raising the question asked. But in my way of thinking, it's not an either or question. We should be providing people with safe places to live, and we should be providing people with food security, and we should be providing people with health care and access to services. But they should also have access to the sense of belongingness that's important. In responding to the Notre Dame question, I pointed specifically to a book by Elaine Scarry called On Beauty and Being Just, which talks about the way some of the things I talked about today, the experience of beauty but also the experience of the sacred, can open people to a sense of shared humanity and a broader sense of empathy that helps them work toward justice. It's a really wonderful book that talks about that. So I hope that helps begin to answer the question. There is much more to be said about that topic. But again, I don't view these as being either or. I will add that in the book, I talk about the way sometimes agencies and communities will blame the buildings for what's wrong from a lack of services and think that they can fix the problem by tearing down the building and building a new building. And really, the problem is they need to provide a greater degree of services. I hope that helps answer the question.
Great response. We have another question. How do we educate a planning commission and board of supervisors that do not understand any of the issues you've explained?
Well, what's happened in some communities, and here's the shameless plug, is people have given them a copy of my book. And I do think that's one reason I wrote the book, and some communities have done that. And it really is to give them this broader sense of why these places are important. They do, the local governments do sometimes view preservation as being frivolous or expendable. And I think it's important for us to try to educate people about the deeper meaning of these places and the way they do have a deeper psychological and emotional meaning, as well as the economic benefits.
Great. Betsy writes, how do you feel about gentrification, which changes everything you have talked about?
So the National Trust recently issued a report about equity that includes a discussion of gentrification. I would point you to that report, which is an extremely thoughtful conversation starter about the relationship between historic preservation and gentrification. As you know, this has been a topic for decades. In my way of thinking, we have not always paid sufficient attention to this question. And when I talked about the continuity between people and place being broken, one thing that I sometimes talk about in longer presentations is the way urban renewal and the displacement that occurred as a result of urban renewal broke the connection between people and their communities and places, and that we are still living with the profound impacts of that displacement. I consider displacement to be an essential topic that we need to continue to tackle in the preservation world. In my way of thinking, the most ideal form of preservation is not a dramatic rehab that drives people out of their existing communities, but a preservation that also keeps the people who wish to remain in their community in their communities and goes to them to ask them what they want their community to be like. And I do think this requires some changes in preservation practice and thought to use new tools that assist in avoiding the displacement of people from existing communities. And we can share further ideas about what some of those tools are, including community land trust and things like that. So that's a much longer discussion, but I do want the person who asked the question to understand that I completely agree. And I think that preservation has to be combined with tools and policies that avoid displacement.
Jim Buxala, who is one of the board members for the CCHPN, writes, terrific presentation. Where there is a desire to preserve historic resources, it is often very hard to find funding grants to support it, unless it has been found to be eligible for listing on the National Register. Can you speak to or speak about possible funding sources for the desire to preserve?
Well, let me say just at the beginning that in America and in most places in the world, but particularly in America, the vast majority of preservation activity occurs by people choosing to simply do it. So it is almost entirely privately funded, whether through people rehabbing their own homes or maintaining their own homes to businesses choosing to locate in historic buildings. Um, there isn't as much funding in the United States from the government as I think there should be, and we don't nearly compare to the countries of the other industrialized countries in terms of funding historic preservation activities. So there are not tremendous amounts of funding. There is the Historic Preservation Fund from the federal government, but mostly, and there are grants from the National Trust. We have a number of grant programs, most of which are relatively modest. And then there are, of course, tax credits. So some of this is done through the tax program, which does support historic preservation. But as the questioner undoubtedly knows, those are limited to buildings either contributing to a National Register historic district or listed in the National Register. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but unfortunately, funding is not as extensive as I wish it were.
All right, looks like maybe we have time for a couple questions and then we'll be getting on to the next session. Uh, we must, as a nation, Mary Sue Boyle writes in, we must, as a nation, respect our history and maintain ordinances that reflect the respect. Europe comprehends such and mandates protection. We do not here, and we are constantly attempting to save valuable historic resources and setting at the last minute as the demolition is proposed to occur momentarily. New tools and greater appreciation. People travel to Europe to value their mandates and tour what they have chosen to protect, preserve, and support.
Um, Mary Sue, thank you for that question. And I couldn't agree more. I do think there not only should be more ordinances protecting historic resources, but also that we should use new tools. And people in the preservation world are definitely pointing in this direction and beginning to look at new tools. I will say that I hope our new tools begin to turn toward the idea of building reuse as a default rather than us having to save individual buildings on a one-by-one basis, on a case-by-case basis. In 50 Ideas for the Next 50 Years, a recent book that was published, I wrote about this idea about how to change the paradigm from individual buildings to a broader sense of building reuse. And I do think it's possible that through sustainability practices and themes, we may be able to move in that direction. So I point you to that book to look at some of the new tools, and I'm happy to talk about that more, but I certainly agree.
Okay, looks like Dorothy's writing in. I'm curious whether respect might qualify as another reason for historic preservation as we grapple with the Black Lives Matter and other issues of continuing racism. Being able to point to the historical contribution of others helps deflate the idea that the others do not belong in our community. As a retired school board member, I long pushed the idea among my colleagues for years that we need to teach African American history far beyond slavery and embrace the contributions and leaderships of many communities. Preservation of associated historic places continues or contributes to this effort. For instance, in Phoenixville, we have at least one Civil War colored troops veteran buried in historic Morris Cemetery, which is an excellent talking point on field trips to Civil War monuments located in the cemetery. Thank you for your thoughts this morning.
Dorothy, thank you for that question and also for suggesting another word. I love it when I get other word suggestions, and I think respect is a great one. And I also completely agree with you about the relationship between preservation and the Black Lives Matter movement and the importance of, as we at the National Trust say, telling the full American story. Telling the full story is a key pillar of the work that the National Trust does. Please go to our website and look at some of the work we've been doing through the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which seeks to do exactly what you're suggesting and help to recognize the absolutely essential and pervasive role that African Americans have played in the nation's country, both as a way of acknowledging that history and helping us to understand it, but also as a work of social and racial justice. As I look at our work with the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund and the way we are identifying places of African American activism and achievement, I am overwhelmed by the relevance of the work that we do to the key issues in American society today, and the way the identification and recognition of these sites gives people that sense of identity and collective memory and collective identity and belonging that is a part of the essential work that we in the preservation world do. So thank you for that question. I'm so glad I had the opportunity to answer it.
Well, it looks like we are out of time. Uh, Thank you so much for tuning into the first program in the CCHPN Virtual Spring Workshop lineup. Our special thanks to Tom Mays of the National Trust for providing us with an exceptional presentation on why old places matter. Like the National Trust, the Chester County Historic Preservation Network is working to preserve our historic resources for ourselves, each other, and our future together. Please visit our website, cchpn.org, for more information, events, membership, and donations. The 9:30 CCHPN Spring Workshop program, Preservation, Planning, and Protection Standards with Janine Spears, is starting now. Please click the link that you received for the 9:30 program to join this second presentation in our series. Have a wonderful weekend, and remember, old places matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you all. It's been a pleasure being with you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Mary.